Alright, welcome back everyone. This is the third episode of my Photoshop post-processing tutorial series. In this episode, we're going to be going over one last nightscape, and that's the shot that you see right here in front of you. This, just like the last episode, is another daytime composite nightscape, this time using a Pano Milky Way shot with an HA modified camera. So this is going to be the last composite nightscape that we'll cover in quite a while, just because at this point I think I've pretty much gone over everything important when it comes to Milky Way drops. So just like last time, I'll start off here by going into Lightroom and showing you the foreground file. This was shot during midday during a very foggy and overcast day, although a lot of this fog is probably also haze. Editing this shot in Lightroom was pretty simple actually this time. I didn't even touch any of these basic sliders over here. All I did was I cropped it so that this lone pinnacle would sit in the center of the frame, framed by the Milky Way arch that I was planning on dropping over here. And I just cranked up the dehaze all the way to 79, which really did a great job of clearing up this file. And at this point, you can even see some of the layers of mountains here in the background. We're going to be using a different sky file for this shot than the other two shots that I went over in episodes 1 and 2. This one is going to be a panoramic full arch Milky Way shot. This I shot with an HA modified A6000. What HA modified means is that the low pass filter in front of the camera sensor has been stripped out and replaced with a UV and IR blocking filter instead. What this does is that it allows the camera sensor to pick up a lot more of the low frequency reds that are associated with hydrogen alpha emissions from star forming regions in our galaxy. You don't see a lot of hydrogen alpha emissions in the core of the Milky Way, but in the tail of the Milky Way, so to speak, in the summer, you will see a lot of HA activity in the Cygnus region. So here, in order to fully highlight the Cygnus region, I decided to shoot the full arch with an HA modified camera instead of my unmodified A7R2 as usual. So raw shots from an HA modified camera are pretty hard to work with, just because, as you can see here, the color balance is a little wacky. This is just a reality of shooting with a modified camera, especially HA mod. You're not going to be able to set the white balance properly in camera at all. So what I recommend is just shooting raw and dealing with the color balance in post. The final sky shot here was constructed with 28 panoed frames. I shot in a serpentine pattern again with 4 rows and 7 columns. You don't have to be very exact in the field, just try to overlap your frames as much as possible. It's not necessary to shoot the exact same number of rows for every column, for example. On the screen right now is the shot after all the individual frames have emerged into a panorama in Lightroom. As you can see, the color balance is way off, so we're just going to go ahead and make some basic adjustments to that first using white balance. First thing we're going to do is turn the saturation up to plus 100, just so we can see what we're working with here. I think there's way too much yellow here in the frame, so I'm going to turn the temperature down as far as it can go. In Lightroom, you're only allowed to go to 2000. Next, it's pretty apparent that there's way too much purple here in the frame, so I'm going to drag this tint slider way down. For this shot, -80 for the tint looks somewhat appropriate, so we'll just leave it there for now. Now we can reset our saturation adjustment and move on to color curves. We'll use RGB curves in order to even out the histogram here between the 3 color channels, red, green, and blue. First, just to get a better representation of the colors that are in the Milky Way, I'm going to crop the frame down to just the parts of the sky that we care about. Now that I've cropped this shot tighter, this histogram represents the color values that we actually care about and not some of the other stuff like light pollution on the horizon and the foreground. Since the red channel looks to be the worst one in the histogram, we'll start off by applying a curves to the red channel. And since it's way out in front of the rest of the histogram, we'll just go ahead and drag this right peak down. Now the right side of the red channel looks reasonably lined up with the rest of the histogram, but the left side is lagging a bit. So we'll drop another adjustment point in the curve and drag that part back up. And that looks pretty good for now. So we'll move next to blues. This time, the peak in the right side of the blue histogram looks like it's lagging a little bit. So we'll drag that up. And after that, the peak on the left side looks like it's ahead a little bit. So we'll drag that down. And finally, we'll clean up a little bit with our greens. The right side of the green is ahead just a little bit. So again, we'll drag that down. And to compensate on the left edge, which is lagging just a tiny bit now, we'll drag that up. At this point, our histogram looks pretty decent. The rest of the color corrections we can just perform in Photoshop. So we're pretty much done with this sky file now. As a comparison, this is what the same sky file looks like after I've edited it in PixInsight. I've also stretched this file in PixInsight using mass stretch, so it looks a little more contrasty than the raw file. But as you can see on the histogram here, PixInsight did a pretty damn good job of evening out the different color channels. But for this shot that I'm going to be breaking down today, I actually use the raw Milky Way instead of the PixInsight edited one. As usual now, we're in Photoshop with just the foreground file showing. Just like the previous 2 episodes, we're going to construct the sky mask by applying a Z-curve and finding an appropriate luminosity mask before cleaning up that mask manually if necessary. I'm not going to go over that in this episode because I think I've done that enough, so I'll just turn on the sky layer. So this is how the shot looks after it's been blended. Next, let's grade the foreground. Because we applied a pretty heavy dehaze in Lightroom, blue is pretty dominant in the tones of the foreground. So we're going to start off first by desaturating the blues with a hue saturation layer. And that layer looks something like this. We're going to decontrast this foreground to make it look a little more like a night shot. Because even though this was shot during an overcast day, which diffused the sunlight, it still doesn't quite look like it was really shot at night. As usual, that decontrasting is done with an inverted S-curve, which if you look in the properties panel, looks like this. And to finish up the foreground grade, we're going to apply S-curves over luminosity masks. First, a lights 1 mask with a curve that looks like a pretty standard S-curve. And next, a darks 5 mask with a very, very strong S-curve. If you're confused by these adjustment layers, I'd recommend that you watch episodes 1 and 2, where I go over in depth how to construct and choose these luminosity masks and apply curves layers to them. At this point, we're pretty much done with our foreground, so we'll move on to grading the sky. The first thing we're going to do is stretch the sky with a levels layer. So as you can see in the histogram here, I've pulled the right side of the levels down just enough to clip off a little bit of the brightest values. And I've done the same on the left here with the blacks. Next, we'll add some additional contrast using curves layer. And note that all of these adjustment layers are clipped to this sky smart object. This curves layer is just a really, really strong S-curve that preserves the brightest parts of the image here so that we're not blowing out any stars or bright parts of the core. Next, we're just going to tweak the hues of the image a little bit to match the foreground a little better. Here's what the adjustments in the hue saturation layer look like. First, for reds, I boosted the hue just a little bit. For the yellows, again, I boosted the hue just a little bit as well. Blues, I cut the hues and increased the saturation just a hair. And the magentas, I really boosted the saturation in order to bring out this nice HA activity here in the Cygnus region of the Milky Way. If you shoot the same Milky Way arch with an unmodified camera, you probably won't get quite as much red and magenta activity here in this region. So that's the reason why I like to shoot my full Milky Way arches with an HA modified camera. I think having the HA activity in the Cygnus region here really helps balance out the right side of the core. So now that we've adjusted the colors for our Milky Way, we're going to move on and apply a little more contrast using luminosity masks. Again, these curves layers are going to be clipped to just the sky smart object. First, a lights 2 to target the brighter parts of the core. Next, a lights 3 to target the brightest parts of the core. And finally, a darks 3 in order to darken the background sky just a little bit. Before I move on to dodging and burning, I just want to point out here that I've actually warped this sky right after it was placed in the document. I wanted the arch to be more symmetrical and to be a little taller in order to fill out the full frame. And so right after I placed the sky file and masked it in, I just applied a free transform and took it into warp mode and just very subtly nudged a couple of control points around. Next, we'll move on to dodging and burning. First up, as usual, is a global burn. Basically, all this is a really strong vignette on the four corners of the image. I've also taken the time to highlight some of the shadows in the center pinnacle. After that, we're going to burn some of the darker portions of the Milky Way core. I like to do this in a separate layer just because if I decide to rewarp the Milky Way afterwards, it means that all I have to do is repaint the Milky Way burn instead of having to repaint my vignette all over again. All I did for this layer is zoom into the Milky Way and find the darker dust lanes. in order to emphasize them a little bit more. This helps the Milky Way pop just a little bit more. And the final adjustment is a dodge layer to highlight this pinnacle here in the center as a leading eye to draw the viewer's attention up to the Milky Way. This was, again, all free painted in by hand. If you have a Wacom tablet, this is actually pretty simple. If you're working with a mouse, just be a little more careful and try to set your opacity a little lower. For dodge burn, I like to start off with the pen and tablet at around 20% opacity, and I'll adjust it up or down if I feel like I need to. With a mouse, I'd recommend starting at 15 or maybe even 10% opacity on a soft brush. Next up, I'm going to clone out this little plane trail here. And I'm going to apply a star minimization effect just like we did in the last episode. If you don't know what this is, watch episode 2 and find in the table of contents in the video description where I go over star minimization. Now we're ready to add some light bleed. In this shot, I decided to center the light source right here in between the mountains here. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I go over light bleed pretty extensively in episodes 1 and 2. So feel free to go back to those videos and find where in the table of contents I go over light bleed. For this light bleed, I duplicated the circular gradient 4 times in total. And just like the last 2 episodes, I masked it into the entire sky and added the foreground mask for lights 1 in order to help that light bleed a little bit more onto the brighter areas of the foreground. At this point, we could actually just apply an Orton lights effects and call it a day. But for this shot, I wanted to add a little extra something. And so I created a composite sunstar, or a moon star rather, using Topaz Star Effects. And that star looks like this. So I'll walk you guys through the process of creating a similar sunstar in Topaz Star Effects. First, you're going to create a new layer and fill it with all black. So make black the background color of your layer and then press Command and Backspace. Next, switch to the brush tool, pressing B. Pick a small brush, something that seems appropriate for the diameter of your light source. For this image, somewhere around 150 pixels seems more or less appropriate. Next, pick a bright, slightly yellowish color. The exact hue is going to depend on what you need for your frame. Personally, I would recommend picking the same color that you chose for your light bleed. Today, I'll just pick something arbitrary, like this. Next, making sure that your brush is at 100% opacity, just click once somewhere near the center of the canvas. So this is the light point that we're going to take into Topaz. Go to Filter, Topaz Labs, and Topaz Star Effects. When you open up Topaz, this is probably not going to be what you see. You're probably going to see something really, really gaudy. But that's okay, because we can find our own settings and make a preset that will allow us to create a natural looking landscape star. Topaz is able to detect bright light sources in a full shot and apply a sunstar where it deems necessary. But I just find it easier to give Topaz a completely black background with a single point source. This way, once we have the final star that we want to composite into the shot, we can drag it around and move it around as we see fit. So here are my star settings for this landscape star preset. Under main adjustments, I have threshold at 0.63, luminance at 0.2, size at 0.57, angle somewhere around 75 degrees, 14 points, and 0.24 spread. Don't take these values to heart. They're just a decent place to start off from. Color adjustments are going to depend on the original hue that you picked for your light source and your light bleed. Under additional effects, if you're compositing a sunstar with light bleed already in the frame, go ahead and just kill the glow completely. So at this point, just play around with the settings, mainly under the main adjustments a little bit until you get a star that seems right for your scene. Once you're all good with that, just press OK, and that will take you eventually back into Photoshop with the layer that you see here. This is the finished star that I was working with once I got out of Topaz. As you can see, I've already free transformed it to shrink a little bit, and I've moved it into position. The first thing that you want to do when coming out of Topaz is to turn the layer blending mode from normal to screen. What screen blending mode does is that it completely erases basically all the black pixels. And because we started with a layer where the entire background was black except for the sunstar, that's going to give you the effect of compositing in just the sunstar. For this shot, because it was a pretty hazy foreground, I didn't think that a sharp sunstar like this was too appropriate for the scene. So what I did was I duplicated this layer and then hit free transform, Command T, dragged the center point over to the middle of the star and rotated it by exactly 0.5 degrees. And you'll see a guide as you rotate the frame, telling you how many degrees you're rotating by. Then I duplicated it again and rotated that another 0.5 degrees counterclockwise. After that, I did the same process, rotating 0.5 degrees clockwise and then 0.5 degrees again. So that gives me a total of 5 different layers for the sunstar that are all offset in rotation just a little bit. And that helps blur it out a little bit. Next, you want to mask the sunstar out of the brighter parts of the sky. This is a pretty easy mask to paint by hand. Mine looks like this. And you'll see that I've also used the mask to limit the reach of some of the blades of the sunstar. This is most easily done with a tablet, in my opinion, but if you're skilled enough with a mouse, you can probably pull this off. So with the mask toggled on and off, the sunstar looks like this. At this point, we're pretty much all done with the edit. We just need to apply an Orton lights effect. I like to turn off the sunstar layer before applying the Orton lights effect in TK actions, just because it gives me a little more control over how I want the sunstar to be composited in the end. And after Orton lights, we'll turn the sunstar back on, and that's our edit. So that wraps up this episode of this breakdown series. This episode, I went through everything super quickly because everything has pretty much already been covered in episodes 1 and 2, apart from the sunstar compositing. I just wanted to show you guys one last case study, so to speak, of a Nightscape drop. But at this point, you should have all the tools that you need to make your own. I probably won't be showing any other Nightscapes for a little while unless I get requests specifically for some frames, just because at this point, I think I've gone over all the tools in my bag of tricks. I'll be back in a week with a new episode about dropping a reflection into a daytime shot.